Hi, I'm Will from the National Housing Federation, and I'm delighted to be joined by Kelsey Walker, who is a director at Savills, affordable housing consultancy leading in governance, risk, and regulation. And importantly for this conversation, she is the chair of the NHF's Housing Governance Conference 2024, which is taking place at the Royal College of Physicians, London, on the 19th of June. Kelsey, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Will. Great to be here.
And we're going to be having a chat about all things housing governance before that event. So, Kelsey, I think when we did this conference last year, we were talking about everything that was sort of new and challenging in housing governance, but it feels like quite a lot has changed actually in the past year, and it all seems very eventful again. So, first of all, do you agree? And if so, what has changed in housing governance?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it is a very lively sector, I think.
Yeah.
And actually, even though when we spoke last year and the conference last year, I think a lot of the drivers for the changes that have happened over the last year were in place then. I think now we're really sort of feeling them sort of hitting and being more real. So, for example, a few things that I think are coming to fruition this year. The financial pressures have been there for a while in the sector, but I think, and even though we can see the economy is going the metrics, interest rates, inflation is going in the right direction, it's still really tough. And so I think there is a lot of board time and executive time thinking about how are we going to manage how are we going to deal with those financial pressures, not just in the immediate term, but over in the sort of slightly longer, longer term. So thinking about what the options are for how you deliver your services, definitely thinking as well around what your merger position is. You might not be actively looking at merger at the moment, but you do want to know at what point it might be a good idea, or what your position is in regionally or nationally in terms of merging with others who might be looking for somebody an organisation to merge with. So just even better understanding on financial governance and understanding of your risk appetite. I think that feels like it's changed this year in terms of it's real, it's on the table, we're having those board away day conversations about it. I think the other thing is recruitment and retention still feels like in key jobs, it's still quite an issue, but also a good governance skills, actually, quite in demand, and a definite recognition that a good guiding hand on governance, especially through more challenging times, is absolutely invaluable. So I do think the people at this conference, will be developing those skills that are really seen as very important. And then I guess finally the consumer standards, which we have talked about for a long time, they are now real. The new consumer approach is in place. We've got a good understanding of how the regulator is going to regulate against those standards. They've given us lots of information, and also the gradings. And I think, we've seen something on what the gradings look like now as well. So I think it's just become less in theory and more, okay, it's with us now. So here we are, get on with it.
Yes, certainly. And we released the agenda for the conference a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago when we recorded this. And obviously that, those new gradings are there. We're talking about them. I wonder what kind of, in sort of your capacity day to day, what kind of patterns of sort of governance have you seen when it comes to registered providers, I suppose, approaching those new standards, those new gradings?
Well, I think clearly there's a risk around, not meeting the outcomes of the new standards, but sure. I think generally there's sort of a feeling that there is opportunities here as well to deliver better targeted, better services to tenants. I think people who are working in the sector, generally want to do that. So there is an opportunity to work with the regulator. I think probably, hopefully, sort of looking for the same things really in terms of delivering those outcomes. I think what is becoming apparent in terms of what I'm seeing, at board away days and board members talking about, there's that appreciation that there are some current gaps in data, which is making some of that data-driven, intelligence-driven decision making a little bit more difficult, and a sort of openness with executive teams about the fact that it's not necessarily where you want it to be. So although you would hope that the compliance and stock information on compliance with health and safety issues was getting a good bit of attention, I do think possibly the assurance on those issues needs to increase. We're in a sort of different place now in terms of how important it is to make sure that that you do fully understand the situation with keeping tenants safe. And probably there's quite a bit of a journey on improving data around your tenants. So I would say, recognising that what progress is being made on improving your data around your tenants, and then get into the great stage where you can match the data you've got on your tenants with the data you've got on your property and really sort of understand where the risks or vulnerabilities are and deliver those services. So we've got data on the agenda for the conference, and we've also got, financial understanding finances as well. So I think we're definitely hitting those hot topics. But you talked to me about gradings. The gradings are interesting, aren't they? The language around the C grading is quite interesting. There's no talk of compliance. It's really all about delivering on the outcomes that are expected. And I think that does show a bit of an understanding that everybody's slightly on a journey, and particularly with local authorities as well, that focus on delivering the outcomes, perhaps more than focus on what your grading will be, because, everybody's going to be at slightly, sort of different places. But I do think the C1 grading, looking at what that says and unpicking it, and knowing that the regulator will have thought about this very long and hard, you can see that a C1 organisation would need to be picking up issues in a timely way, putting in plans to remedy any problems, learning from those problems, and making sure that they don't happen again. So I think, it's not about not ever having any problems or not failing on an individual level from time to time, but it's about what do you do about identifying those issues, resolving them, making sure that you've learned. So a learning culture feels quite an important success factor in meeting these standards. So I think that'll be interesting to see how governance teams are, getting on with that challenge, really.
Yeah, that's interesting, and we'll definitely speak about this at the conference in quite a lot of detail. But asking you a rather broad follow-up question, I wonder what's the sort of working relationship between boards and governance teams when it's sort of reaching that compliance, getting that assurance, because this is not entirely new, but it is different. How do you think that sort of affects that relationship, or how do you think they can go about it? Either of those questions.
Well, it's great to see when heads of governance have that really good, strong relationship with the chair and with boards. It's interesting, would be an interesting discussion in the breakout areas about what how those relationships do work in organisations, because it seems to me that there are some where the chair, is clearly relying on the guiding hand of the governance team to really sort of steer the board, and there's others where it feels a little bit more transactional, I suppose, and how much as a governance person you sort of might lean into that, more generally. But But no, I think in terms of regulatory standards, it's these standards are very outcomes focused. So
Mm,
even the governance standard was never all about having perfect governance arrangements in place. It's about how are you ensuring that you're delivering on the outcomes that are set out in the standards, and they're not necessarily within the remit of the governance function.
mm,
They are have you got an effective risk management approach, or are you managing your risks well? Those would be the sorts of things that would be the focus of regulatory attention. So I just think that, the governance teams recognizing that it's not all about self-assessment. It's not all about, kind of compliance, but it's
yeah.
about what are these standards really saying ought to be a good outcome, and looking more broadly across the forward plan of board agendas, whether you're sort of picking up on those issues really. So I mean,
Mm.
it's not a quick win, I don't think. It's
No.
a whole organization approach.
Yeah, interesting how that nothing's
Mm,
ever a quick win, but as it should be, I suppose. Um, I don't want to get too sort of focused on kind of what's new, because I think a lot of the things that you know governance teams are really trying to think of today, or the organizations are really trying to
yeah,
deal with, are quite long-standing changes. And
absolutely.
you
Yeah.
you you alluded to some of these in your first answer. So I suppose just thinking about those pressures on governance teams, those real challenges, having to do more with less. How can they sort of build resilience into the function? How can they meet this challenging
Mm,
environment?
mm. Well, I think we just got to make sure that there sort of isn't any sense of silos. I think
Yeah.
I had a really interesting kind of conversation the other day with a chief operating officer and a director of governance. And it really made me think how, with organizations maybe starting to look at more localized operating models, or look at different ways of engaging with tenants, that it's a really good opportunity for governance teams and operations teams to work in tandem, and really think
Mm,
about how the governance needs to change to reflect perhaps how the operating model is changing. So
mm,
clearly, some of the questions about, well, if you've got a problem over here in this area or this region or whatever, how quickly can it be dealt with locally, or how does it, in a timely way, get escalated to where it needs to be heard? So I do think that there's some really interesting kind of coming together of governance teams with the
yeah.
operational sides of the business, to sort of think about what is happening on the ground and how that's reflected in information flows and decision making. So there's quite a lot to talk about there, and I think be really interesting to hear what other people have to say. But there also needs to be this focus on helping boards, I think, deal with a very broad agenda. There are financial pressures, there are consumer issues, there's all of the risks that have always been there, and then there's new ones as well. So how, the one thing that we hear quite often is boards are feeling a bit overwhelmed, and how do
Yeah.
they sort of manage all of this? So I think definitely from a governance team perspective, and this is a bit of a quick win, it feels, that,
Mm,
making sure that some of that housekeeping, the very clear delegations, clear accountability through the governance structure. Does everybody know what they're doing, where,
mm,
and the parameters with which they're working in, and the triggers for escalation and things like that? They can really help manage the overall workload of the board.
mm.
And I think, focusing on those areas along with high quality reporting, and making sure that makes it a bit easier for boards to get everything they need to make a decision, but not get huge, great, big, dense reports. They generally
Yeah.
don't need them and don't like them. So maybe make everybody's life a little bit easier if we weren't servicing with so much
Yeah.
dense reporting. So yeah, a couple of things there really to think about. Um, and I guess finally, governance leads might want to think about how how there is communication with tenants about how their views have been taken into account when decisions have been made. So it is closing that loop. It's a key part of the consumer standards that you tell tenants how their views have been taken into account when making decisions. So again, for me, that operational governance link, they need to be quite strong, and maybe they haven't been in the past, so it's a real opportunity to think about how to do things collaboratively and maybe a little bit differently in that sphere, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting and insightful. And of course, we end the conference, I believe, with a session on resident voice, and maybe closing some of those loops. We'll come into it as well. Just turning to the conference, we've got a lot of people who attend year on year. Some people it's very new. You've been involved with it the past few years, I think.
Yes.
Longer than me, at least. So why are you looking forward to it this year?
Well, this year, obviously, we are covering the consumer standards and what that means in practice. But I think, and how to prepare, and that's all going to be helpful context. And we do have the very recently previous director of regulation with us. So we're hoping that, she'll be pretty open and honest about how the regulator is approaching this and what her advice might be now that she's outside of the regulator and what she's seeing with, on the other side, as it were. So that would be interesting. As I say, I think we're hitting on lots of hot topics. I'm really interested to hear about the merger fatigue, because I think there is a lot of it going on, but actually how much is too much, and how do you avoid the sort of, the exhaustion that comes from doing one merger after another. So that will be good. We are looking at understanding finance, data and assurance. I'm really interested on what good looks like in terms of delivering on EDI as well, which we've picked up for the last couple of years, but again, we need to sort of be continuing to see how that's developing from a governance perspective in organizations. And then we have a major out of sector case study of when governance goes wrong. And I know lots of people are going to be interested in this particular case study. So I think that's going to be a fantastic one for us to just lift our heads and look out a little bit and see what learning we can do across other sectors. So that's, everything really.
Yes.
And seeing everybody and, those conversations that take place in the margins of other events.
Yeah, of course, and that's often like you end up taking away things that you didn't expect to take away as well at these events. Right, brilliant. Well, it's been a brilliant conversation. I wonder if I could just put you on the spot and say in a sentence or two why people should attend Housing Governance this year.
Well, I think it is. There's always a good reason to take your lift your head up and look outwards a little bit. But I feel like more than ever now, and I've been absolutely in this position where it feels like you're just a bit too busy, and it's difficult to make the time. And should you sort of get on with something else instead? But it just feels like coming to the conference pays back, tenfold, because of the things that you'll take away that will help you sort of do that job, do your job better. And sometimes in governance, it can be a little bit lonely. There's usually small teams, so it's really good to make those connections with other people. So I suppose it's the same as ever, but it does feel like we're right at the start of a new regulatory regime. And we've been talking about it for years. So let's get together and see how people are preparing.
That's brilliant, and a nice way to end this conversation. So for everyone watching this, Housing Governance 2024 is on the 19th of June at the Royal College of Physicians in London. When this video goes out, there will be about 3 weeks, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, until the early bird deadline for that, which is on the 26th of April, which is when you get the best prices for your tickets. Kelsey Walker, thank you very much. You've been very generous with your time.
Thank you very much, Will Herbert.
Right.
See you there.
I'll see you there. Yeah.